G'day friends, we are in the twilight of our series in the book of Daniel, living in exile. Daniel is in the twilight of his life. Actually, he's more than likely in his 80s at this point as we head into Daniel chapter 10, 11 and 12. But we know Daniel. We know that Daniel's not the sort of man who kicks back in his slippers and just resigns himself to watch the world go by. No, Daniel's a man interested in the way things pan out. We saw that last week in his prayer. And so this week, we see that there's been another big development for Daniel. In the chapter 10, verse 1, there's a time reference. It is the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. That puts us more than likely in the year 536 BC. The big thing about Cyrus reigning is it's referred to in another Old Testament book, Ezra. In his first year, he makes a declaration, and this declaration is that Israel can go home. Physical exile is over, that the people can go home. Now, this is a big deal for Daniel, of course. He's been praying about this. He doesn't go with them, but I wonder what his thoughts are. Ezra tells us that 42,000 go back, so, Daniel would know about this. And I wonder if you can imagine with me what Daniel's thinking and feeling as he watches that procession leave Babylon to go back home. I wonder if he's feeling grieved that he doesn't get to go. He was uprooted from there so many decades before, and now he's watching them to go back and be planted again. I'm wondering if there's grief over all of the years, all that's been lost for him. But I also wonder if there's joy for him, joy that his prayers have been answered. He was praying last week that exile would finish, and now here it is. I wonder if there's joy for him that God has come through. God is doing this. And I also think, given the content of chapters 10, 11 and 12, I actually think that Daniel's probably not a little anxious for that little flock heading back to Jerusalem. I actually wonder if he is thinking, Lord, are they going to be okay? He was told that physical exile would end, but he was told that exile would continue, even for them that go back. And so I wonder if the prayer on Daniel's lips as they leave is, Lord, are they going to be all right? Chapter 10 is a couple of years on from then, and we're told that Daniel has a revelation of a great war, which I'm sure doesn't do much for his blood pressure, given his thinking of that little flock gone back to Jerusalem. He fasts and he prays, and while he's on the riverbank, he has a vision which is going to explain his revelation. Now, there's a lot of details, but remember, in this sort of literature, the main things are the plain things. He's confronted by this shiny, powerful, foreboding angel figure, and that angel is going to be his apocalyptic tour guide. And so notice Daniel in this. What's one of the plain things? It's Daniel's response. He is over the top astounded. This is apocalyptic literature, noticing what it does in Daniel. His senses are assaulted and stunned, and ours are meant to as well. Apocalyptic literature is a bit like looking at art rather than reading a story. It's meant to impress you, not necessarily inform you, and we see that happening in Daniel. Now, this angelic messenger, there's some stuff in chapter 10 about kind of this delay because there's a conflict at a whole spiritual level with no real explanation what that means. So if you're reading this and you think, I don't actually grasp what's going on in the experience of Daniel, good. I don't either, and that's the way we're meant to feel. The big thing we're meant to see from Daniel chapter 10 is this idea of strengthening. Daniel is weakened and then he's strengthened, and he embodies this relationship with God's people and God. Daniel goes to liquid when he's confronted with this revelation. Verse 17, we're told, I can't talk, my strength is gone, I can hardly breathe. But instead of passing out, he is strengthened. The messenger of God gives him strength by touch and strength by word. He says, peace. Be strong now, be strong. And so the main thing is Daniel is strengthened for the task. He's given enough to be present, to be there. Don't miss his kind of embodiment of weakness and then strengthening. It's this rhythm of God's people. And so we head into chapter 11 verse 2. We hear what this messenger is going to say about this great war. The other night, my son couldn't sleep, and so we flicked on the TV and we watched the end of a movie, Robin Hood, actually, the Russell Crowe one. Now, we hadn't watched the movie, we hadn't kind of ridden the wave of the tension, we didn't know the storyline at all. It was just this battle scene at the end. So we're coming in cold to this battle scene, there's lots going on, and my boy, he says, what's going on here? What is this? And I said, look, I don't know the details, buddy, but here's some things I do know. I know Russell Crowe, our boy Rusty, he's the goodie. He's always the goodie, isn't he? And I know there's some unattractive scowling characters there. They're the baddies. Baddies always scowl. But as for that, we didn't know the details of what this cavalry charge was, or those, we kind of got the gist of the movie, but the details were foggy. And so we just watched this kind of unfolding foggy battle scene happen before us. Chapter 11 is actually meant to feel a little bit like that as well. Some details of Daniel, kind of looking into the future history for him, some of them fit. It looks like Alexander the Great makes, an appearance, and some of his generals. But as this chapter 11 goes on, it increasingly gets less linked to historical unfolding. And so the point isn't to play kind of historical guess who, but it's just to see foggy, human, beastly battle scenes over and over again. Just like in every age of fallen, beastly human history. We see the assertion of power, whether that's through military force or invasion or marriage alliances or deception, intrigue, politics, religious involvement. There's pride against God in this chapter. There's idolatry and exploitation and panic. Every generation reading this can find people and regimes for whom the cap fits. And that's the point. It just is foggy human battle scene. But in the middle of it, did you see that? God's people are doing what God's people are meant to do. Verse 32 in chapter 11, those who know God resist godless rulers. Verse 33, they show wisdom, they share wisdom, and they pay the price for that. They're burned and captured and plundered. Verse 35, they're purified and refined. God does his work through them in difficult times. And of course, they wait. It's what God's people do. They wait. Wait for the appointed time. And at this point, the message for Daniel is, Daniel, you know this. You've tasted this in the crazy and vicious and beastly kingdoms. You've lived through Big Neb, Belshazzar, Darius, now Cyrus. You've lived the works. The message is, Daniel, it's going to continue. Not just here in Babylon, but also back home. But you need to know that in the same way God has been faithful to you, he will continue to be faithful to his people. You need to know and continue in that. He's in control. There are beastly kingdoms, but he's faithful. Be strong now, Daniel, be strong. And that's something, isn't it? That is a sense of comfort, but it's going to continue. In chapter 12, there's going to be more for Daniel to understand. I love lookouts. There's not too many of them in Goondiwindi, but when I get the chance, I love going up, mountains, valleys. It's beautiful. There's a grandeur, isn't there? We were at Picnic Point in Toowoomba a little bit ago, and I just love the visual progression as you look down the escarpment and you see, Withcott and Tabletop, Helidon, but then as you look right out on the horizon where you see hills kind of blend in with clouds, that's the beauty, isn't it? As you strain your eyes to the horizon, it's far and it's blurred and it's beautiful. It's specifics get smudged into scenery the further you look out. Daniel chapter 12 is that for Daniel. He's looking a long way off down the rolling hills of time. Specifics are going to be smudged for him. He's given enough of what is coming, but there's actually going to be a limit to what he can take in. There will be, far off on the horizon, yes, Daniel, there's going to be distress, but there's going to be deliverance. You know about those rhythms, but he's given more. There will actually be justification for God's people, and there will be judgment for those against God. So for Daniel, while it seems that God's people are just at the mercy of the beastly kingdoms over and over again, this chapter 12 is actually saying that's going to end. That's going to come to an end. For the truth that God is in control to be truly comforting, we need this boundary, this limitation, this accountability that unjust, cruel and exploitative kingdoms and people will be brought to account. There will be justice. And so here's the picture of what will happen. Both those who have lived walking with God will be raised, and those who have railed against him will be raised. Verse 2, some to everlasting life, we're told, and some to everlasting shame, everlasting contempt. Notice our word that we've been looking at throughout this series, wise. Those who have been wise, they'll be raised in brightness and prominence. The message is, Daniel, you might be worried for your little crew that's heading back now and what will become of them. But know, Daniel, that God's eye is actually on every single generation. He knows and he cares and he will vindicate. There will be judgment. Babylon won't prevail. The king of the north, king of the south won't prevail. Persians, Medes, Greeks, Romans, evil won't prevail. There will be a final judgment. And this judgment is good news for Daniel because looking off in the distance, he sees that there is a boundary mark. There is something that is containing Daniel here, and that's good news. We don't really like the idea of judgment. No one likes exams or people looking over our shoulder. We don't want that sort of thing in our life. But we actually need it. We need that sort of containment, that boundary marker to give us purpose, to give life meaning. One of the great lies and temptations of Babylon is that it erodes, that it dissolves those boundaries. It says the here and the now is the only thing that matters. There's no ultimate accountability or limits. There's no end point, no purpose, no judge. And if that's the case, then you should live to the glory of self, because that's all you've got. This is the message. Eat, drink, for tomorrow you die, and you are just left to your own beastly instincts to live. Incline everything toward yourself. This is the message of Babylon. Even your kindest or most benevolent acts are to either be favours to be called in at another time, or they should be at least a little bit therapeutic so you feel better about yourself. Babylon dissolves the boundaries and limits and the ultimate accountability. Babylon is like the kid in the above ground pool that bumps up against the sides and thinks this pool is too small for me, I'm too great for it. But the day that same kid kicks a panel out of the above ground pool, he doesn't have more pool, he has less pool. And so we see that the boundaries here, the accountability that's given to Daniel is actually good news for us. Because Babylon dissolves us into pointless existence, endless competition, and cruel injustice. But the truth gives us meaning, the truth of eternal life or eternal contempt. This is truth, and it's good for us. The worst thing possible for us is to live out of step with reality. The worst thing for us is that we don't have what is actual. We need the charity of boundaries. And that's what's given in chapter 12. Now, this idea of judgment and what that means for us, it can be abused and confused a little bit. So it's really important we're on point about what judgment is all about. And I'll get to that in a minute. But right now, I want us to see a little bit more of what happens in Daniel chapter 12, how this ends for him. In verse 4, Daniel is essentially told, okay, that's enough, Daniel, you're done. There's stuff here for you to see and understand from afar, but you're going to have to be content with just that. There's a tiny bit more where there's this kind of angelic Q&A, and he's told how much longer, and it'll be time, times, and half a time. Which is apocalyptic speak. It's 3.5 years, for it's going to be a little while longer, but not forever. We're just going up a bit further. If the 7 is the full number, it's halved. And so he's told these things will happen in time. Daniel hears, but he doesn't understand. We see his limitation. But he's told in verse 9, go your way, Daniel. It's now closed and sealed. This scroll is closed and sealed. It's not for you to open. Again in verse 13, chapter 12, go your way, Daniel, rest. You'll get your inheritance, Daniel, which I reckon is the Old Testament version of well done, good and faithful servant. There's a beautiful finishing here, closure for Daniel, a beautiful ending for the wise disciple, isn't it? Of course, you and I occupy a different time from Daniel. I don't just mean we don't live in ancient Babylon. I mean we don't live in the same time period, the same era as him. He was a part of the Old Testament, and we don't just divide our Bible like that. We divide our time like that as well. We live in New Testament times, you and I. We have a progressed understanding of God's unfolding history. We occupy a different time because we live this side of the cross. Daniel does end up being limited. That limit he feels in that's because he is a part of that time. And so it's not that we're any more special than he is, it's just that we live further downstream from him. There is this other book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation. It too is an apocalypse, a vision. And John, the writer of Revelation, he seeks to continue on this story. It's like the sequel to Daniel, as it were, because he riffs off all of the ideas that Daniel has raised here. He picks up this idea of the scroll being sealed and us unable to be able to read what is the rest of unfolding history. Daniel and his limited knowledge is there. John says, I think John sees it unfolding even more. John joins Daniel for a tiny bit where he weeps that no one can unfold that scroll. He wants to know, how does history make sense as well? How do we get an up-close view of what God is doing? And then for John in Revelation chapter 5, that's where he finds the moment, or where someone is shown who can open it, who can progress God's plan. Daniel, notice Daniel hears but he can't understand in chapter 12 verse 8. John picks up that same language and he hears but then he sees. He hears who can open it, who can progress history. He hears that it's going to be the Lion of Judah, the root of David, the one who is conquered. He hears about a royal and powerful victor. He hears about a new king. Man, kings have been what it's been all about through Daniel, and now there is another king. What's this king going to be like? Who's this king that is actually going to be able to progress history rather than just being a beastly repetition of the previous one? Daniel hears but can't understand. John hears and he sees and he looks. Not a Nebuchadnezzar figure, not a grand golden image with brittle feet. No, what he sees is nothing like the other kings of this world. He turns and he sees a lamb standing as slain. We don't tend to think of powerful lambs. That's not a thing that we have, is it? And this lamb, worse, is killed, sacrificed. But this lamb standing as slain is victorious. And so you know what this is saying. This is saying Jesus, the one who gives up his life on the cross, he is the one who is worthy to unfold history, unfold the end. He is the true king, crucified, resurrected. He shows his ultimate power through ultimate weakness. And so what you and I can see that Daniel can't is that our King, this real Saviour, is Jesus Christ. He's the King who conquers by dying, the King who is first to be vindicated by God and raised to everlasting life. Notice God's people were still in exile. They went back physically to Jerusalem, but they're still in exile. They're back with the bricks and mortar temple, but they're still separated from belonging and blessing with God. And Jesus comes as the King and he explodes this idea of exile and belonging. And he says, wherever I am, that's where there is true belonging and blessing. He's the temple on legs with the people. And so everything changes because of the cross. His people, his subjects, they can be anywhere. His people and his subjects, it is similar. They will be weak and they will be overcome and they'll be overwhelmed, but he is present. He will strengthen them. He strengthens them to live as wise disciples no matter what hostile age they live in. And he is the final judge. He fills in the gaps. John fills in the gaps for Daniel. All the beastly kingdoms are going to be judged and overthrown, and it'll be just Jesus' kingdom that lasts. He alone will win, and only the citizens that live according to that one will have life. And so for you and I to talk about judgment then, let's think about judgment. Let's think about wisdom in judgment. So if you're going to be a good citizen of Babylon, if you're going to live for self and for strength, for beastly pride and power and beastly pleasure, you're going to be living a Babylon wherever you are. And that's foolish, because Jesus is going to judge those kingdoms as anti-God and anti-life. And friend, you're backing a dud if that's the way you're living. Everlasting shame and contempt are coming your way. Whereas what is wise life in terms of judgment? Well, it's hearing and seeing Jesus as the true King. It's aligning your life with his kingdom. Wherever you are, it is saying with your life, Lord Jesus, your kingdom, your way, your rule, that's what I'm going to bow to. No more me, no more me. You get the final say over everything, Lord Jesus. That's a wise decision. That's the place of everlasting life. That's the good place. And so our series has been all about living as wise disciples. Despite our fear in apparent circumstances, like Daniel, we can trust God. Because we know the victory of King Jesus, we can live wisely in a hostile world. I reckon one of the apocalypses, one of the uncoverings, revelations, is of a wise disciple. Daniel living wisely in a hostile place day to day. We've seen that over his whole life. Chapter 1 as a teenager, chapter 12 as an old man. Daniel walks the line of wisdom. And so on one hand, we've seen him invest in Babylon. He's a long-standing part of it. During exile, there was a bunch of Israelites that headed outside the city to live in a little holy huddle, a ghetto on their own, and the prophet Jeremiah slams them. You should be in there. Daniel is in there. He's respectful to Nebuchadnezzar. He saves the pagans. He's valued by Darius. He's engaged and he's good at what he does. And yet we also see the wisdom in it. He knows when to take a stand. He won't eat the choice food. He won't stop praying to God. And he doesn't suffer the fool Belshazzar one little bit. He's firm when the time is right. He knows which hills to die on, and he's pretty winsome when he does it too. And so I would love to finish with really good practical advice, application for you to go out into your various circumstances, but I just can't do that. And so what I'm going to do is finish with two ends of the spectrum and how we live in between. So on one hand, if you're relying on the world and the systems and the governments of this world to satisfy you, whether that's our government, whether that's Netflix or the lotto, friend, it won't do that. Only the Lamb that was slain can satisfy you. And yet on the other hand, if you're going to shake your fist at the systems of this world, withdraw yourself. If you're going to shake your fist at the government and say, how dare you government treat us like this, if you're going to just excuse yourself from it, that's also not what we're called to. And so we don't depend on the world's systems and we don't withdraw from them either. And so we need to operate in this in-between bit. And so what are you called to in that? Well, you're called to be humble, forgiving in that. You're called to receive strength from our Lord God. You're called to be persecuted and purified. Don't be surprised when those things come. You're called to invest in a dying world, to be in it, not of it, but in it. And you're called to draw lines in the sand when it comes to it against beastly Babylon. Friends, you'll stuff it up. You'll be foolish every now and then, but that's why the Lamb was slain. That's good news. And so you're also called to repent and keep going. And while I can't give you specific directions because I don't know what you're going to face this week, I do know that Jesus Christ lives with his people by his Spirit. He wants to guide you in this. He does that by you reading his word and meeting with him in prayer. He does that by you meeting with his people, seeing his body. And so don't get weary in those things. Friends, keep going as wise disciples living in this space. I think Peter the Apostle sums it up really well, what living like a wise disciple is. He writes, to God's elect exiles scattered throughout the world, and that could be Stanthorpe, Warwick, Goondiwindi, or wherever you are. Dear friends, I urge you as exiles and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires that wage war against your souls. That's Babylon. Abstain from it. But instead live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. That's what it is to live as a wise disciple.